All right. Like I said in an earlier video, there are two more versions or formulations of the categorical imperative. We've got the formula of universal law. We skipped the formula of natural law. I talked about the formula of humanity. There are two more that I'm going to talk about, although one I'm only going to talk about very briefly, and that is the formula of autonomy. The reason why I'm only going to talk about the formula of autonomy briefly is it, like the formula of natural law, is very similar to the formula of universal law. There's really only one key point to realize that's different, or Kant wouldn't say different because remember he thinks these are all equivalent, but there's one difference of emphasis between the formula of universal law and the formula of autonomy. Where he states the formula of autonomy is here. He calls it the third principle. The third practical principle of the will is the supreme condition of its harmony with universal practical reason, namely the idea of the will of every rational being as a will laying down universal law. Okay, so we have the idea of universal law just like we do in the formula of universal law. This isn't stated in the form of an imperative, though, which is weird. If we were to state it in the form of an imperative, we would state it in the following way. Act only in a way that respects all rational beings as legislators of the universal law. In a way, the formula of autonomy can be seen as a kind of combination of the formula of universal law and the formula of humanity. In the formula of universal law, it's directed just at you, and it's just about saying, make sure the maxims you decide to follow are the maxims that you could will as universal law. You could conceive of yourself choosing and want to choose for everyone else to follow the same principles. But it doesn't tell you anything about other people. The formula of humanity is all about other people. It's all, I mean, it's not entirely about them because you're supposed to not use yourself as means either, or as mere means. But it's all about the attitude you should take towards other people's humanity, towards other people's ability to be rational beings. The formula of autonomy sort of combines those. It says, act in such a way that you're respecting the fact that you and everybody else is legislating universal law. That's what Kant thinks you're doing, right? When you're behaving rationally. You're staking out principles that you want everybody to follow. If you're being rational, you're following the formula of universal law, which means you want everybody else to live by these same principles. You think you're expressing your rational nature, right, when you decide on principles to act on. So it combines other people, right, or it brings other people into it the same way that the formula of humanity does. And it brings other people into it in exactly the way the formula of humanity would want you to, because it's talking about us being legislators of the law. Remember, autonomy is giving yourself the law. But the idea is, with the formula of universal law, it's not just for us, right? We've got to come up with principles that everyone else accepts too, right? Because we have to act on principles that we can universalize. That's what the formula of universal law says. So the formula of autonomy sort of sums up or combines the key elements of the formula of universal law and the formula of humanity. Now, Kant is not going to admit that the formula of universal law is missing something that the formula of humanity has, because he thinks these are all equivalent. But these different formulations are all just about highlighting different aspects of the same fundamental principle. And it all goes back to our rational nature. You can see that even with the formula of universal law, because the idea implicit in the formula of universal law is that you are able to choose which maxims to act on, right? That you're not just forced to obey or act in accordance with certain maxims. So if you find yourself with a desire to do something, all right, and you're thinking, all right, I'm going to go do X in order to get Y because I desire Y, right, in circumstances C or whatever. Kant is implicitly saying, by addressing the formula of universal law to you, that you can take a step back, you can evaluate this desire you're about to act on, and you can choose not to act on it if that desire is not law-like, if that desire can't be universalized. So the formula of autonomy sums up the formula of universal law and formula of humanity, or presents them in a combined way, in a way that more obviously combines the biggest features of each. But the one that's really interesting is the one I'm going to spend most of the time on in this video. It's the formula of the kingdom. Whoops, just misspelled kingdom. Formula of the kingdom of ends. Now, the translation I've got you using doesn't actually use the term kingdom. So you come down here. He says, the concept of every rational being is one who must regard himself as giving universal law through all the maxims of his will, so as to judge himself and his actions from this standpoint, leads to the fruitful concept of a realm of ends. He's translating the German word Reich as realm instead of kingdom because he wants to avoid the idea that there's a king. Right? But here is how to interpret this whole passage. All right, so now we come to the final formulation, the formula of the kingdom of ends. Act only on maxims that would be accepted by all other rational beings. It's very often added, in a hypothetical kingdom of ends. The kingdom of ends formulation is usually thought to be Kant's attempt to show what the social sort of aspect of all this is. So here's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to imagine that you live in a society or kingdom in which everyone is rational. Now, in a sense, you already do, Kant thinks, because everyone is rational. But everyone is not only rational. Right? In addition to being rational, we also have the non-rational part of us. So Kant is just like Plato and Aristotle in this. There's this conflict between the rational and the irrational aspects of your mind. The rational aspect is completely separate from the desiring aspect. Now that's where Plato and Aristotle would have jumped off. Plato would have thought, no, there are rational desires. The rational part of your soul desires things. Aristotle probably too thought this. In fact, definitely thought this because he thought that a life of contemplation was what a rational being would choose. But for Kant, that's not how it is. Now, that said, Kant doesn't imagine these rational people lacking any desires. He just imagines people who are sort of fully, they have full rational control of themselves, right? They don't do the irrational thing that they have the power to avoid. So Kant thinks every person has the ability to act in accordance with reason. In this way, he also differs somewhat from Plato and Aristotle, who did seem to think there were some people who were just sort of out of luck, right? They were either too stupid, this was Plato's idea, or they lacked the proper upbringing, that was Aristotle's idea. Kant doesn't think that. Kant thinks anyone can live rationally, can live with sort of rational control over their life. But he also thinks often people don't. He thinks people have the ability, and some, maybe most, maybe even all, when he's writing in his most pessimistic moods, people fail to be fully rational. That's why this is a merely hypothetical situation. You're imagining a situation where everybody only does the rational thing. And you're supposed to imagine that you, along with everybody else in this kingdom, is part of one big legislature, one big body that comes together to decide the principles on which everyone will live. And the claim that he's making here is the principles that you should live by would be the ones that could be accepted by everyone in this rational legislature, or all the rational beings in this legislature. Now, this is a little hard to imagine. It's a little hard to understand exactly what Kant means here. So I'm actually going to provide you the sort of updated version of this that was developed by a philosopher in the 1950s and 60s named John Rawls, and it's called the original position. All right, so here's what Rawls, who was a follower of Kant's, he was basically trying to explain Kantian ethics, but in a more modern way. So Rawls was very concerned with making Kant's views fit better with like contemporary economics. So what he did is he turned the formula of the kingdom of ends into something like a game theory problem. If you're not familiar with game theory, you can look it up. There's all sorts of videos online. So he says, here's how we should pick the principles that we all live by. Now, Rawls was primarily concerned with political philosophy, not so much with like everyday ethics, but I'm going to be presenting you a version of Rawls's approach that will have implications for this. Here's what you do when you're picking principles to live by. When you want to pick moral principles, you imagine that you and everyone else you live with, because there's an inevitable social aspect to morality, you imagine that you and everyone else you live in society with are behind what's called the veil of ignorance. Now, the veil of ignorance is just it's an imaginary construct, right? The idea is that when you're behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know many things about yourself. You don't know who you are. Like you don't know your name. You don't know how much money you have. You don't know how well educated you are. You don't know your religion. You don't know your race. You don't know your sex or your gender. You don't know your sexual orientation. You don't know your own political ideologies, right? Your own ethnicity. You don't know any of these things about yourself. And neither does anyone else. Everyone is behind the veil. And what everyone's trying to do is pick the best principles for them from behind the veil, but principles that will apply after the veil of ignorance is lifted. So you have to imagine like everybody in society is like hooked up to a computer, right? And the computer temporarily blocks their access to their own knowledge about their life. So all they can do is think about, well, one day this block will be removed, and I'll remember who I am, I'll remember all these things about myself. But I've got to decide now, when the block is in place, when the veil of ignorance is in place, what principles we're all going to live by together. So you're choosing principles behind the veil of ignorance that will apply in regular life outside of the veil. Now, why is this a good way to do things? Well, Rawls pointed out, let's say you took everybody as they actually were. You got everybody in society together in a big room, right? And you said, all right, everybody, we've got to decide on principles we're all going to live by. So people start suggesting principles, and anybody who objects, raise your hand to object. Right? Say why you object. I don't think any of us are idealistic enough to believe that anyone is going to be able to get a single principle accepted by everybody, right? Because the rules that we live by impact what we can do, and that's the whole point. They're supposed to tell us how to behave. And because they impact what we do, they can have better or worse effects on various people, right? So for example, let's say you start out with something that you might think is obvious. No one can sell drugs like heroin that can kill you. Right? Well, we already know some people who are going to object. Heroin addicts and heroin dealers, they're going to object. Right? You're like, okay, well, no one can like own anybody else. Well, there's lots of people engaged in various forms of human trafficking and things like that. They're going to object. And those are just the easy ones. Those are the ones where you could probably get like 90% of the population agreeing with you. But there's all sorts of more complicated moral issues. As an example of another moral issue, take the moral issue of whose responsibility it is to clean up pollution. So every time some big company pollutes some waterway or some field or pollutes the air or something like that, there's an issue raised about whose job it is to pay to clean it up. And you can imagine two different principles. One that says whoever actually did the polluting, it's their job to clean it up, and the state can force them to do so. And if necessary, the state can seize their assets in order to pay for the cleanup of the pollution. Or you could have a principle that says the community as a whole cleans this up. Right. So there we've got two principles. You could see how this issue could generate lots and lots of disagreement. But and even when people are, trying to be fair about it, you could see how it's going to lead to disagreement. In part because if you either are part of that company, right, that polluted, or if you have some kind of economic relationship with the company that polluted, you're probably going to end up saying, well, no, of course the company shouldn't do it. That's too much of a burden to place on a single company. Society is the one that needs the pollution cleaned up, so society should do it, or the government should do it. But if you're not like an employee of that company, or a shareholder in that company, or a corporation that does business with that company, you might think, we didn't do this, right? And so we shouldn't be the ones to have to pay to clean this up. They're the ones who did it. They should clean it up. You also might point out that if the companies can pollute and probably save money by polluting, right? So it's usually expensive to be clean. And so they saved money by polluting. And then if they can just push all that cost of cleaning up after themselves to society as a whole, well, now they've got no incentive to ever be clean again. So you can see how these disputes could generate a lot of disagreement, motivated in part by what your self-interest is. And so it can't be people as they are that you have to come to an agreement with. That's why Kant thinks you're considering people as rational beings. The way Rawls understands that is make everyone forget everything about themselves, and you're going to get them behaving rationally. The example he uses is of a cake. So like, let's say you've got a cake, and you have to come up with some way of dividing the cake fairly among everybody. Now, let's say you've got 8 kids, and you've got one knife, and how are you going to get the kids to cut this cake fairly? Well, Rawls says the common sense answer is the following. You have the person who cuts the cake get the last piece. That will ensure that they will try to cut the cake as fairly as possible, because there's no way for them to benefit themselves. There's no way to get themselves the best piece, because if they cut, right, a giant ass piece like this, and then everybody else gets little pieces, this is going to come out to more than 8, isn't it? Let me check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah. So there's 9 kids, it turns out. If this is the way they cut up the piece, right, then the person who cut the cake won't see this big piece here. They'll never get that, because the first person to pick will get that. They're going to end up with whatever the smallest of the remaining pieces are. The way to do it is to set it up so that the people making the decision about how to allocate burdens, how to allocate costs and benefits, can't give themselves some kind of special deal by so doing. But if everybody is involved in picking the benefits and the costs, picking the principles that decide benefits and costs, then the only way to do that is make it so no one can benefit themselves from doing this. And the only way to do that, Rawls thinks, is to take from them the knowledge of how to go about benefiting themselves. Like, take me. I'm an upper middle class white male in America. It's a good gig. There's all sorts of things that people have suggested to make America a more moral and just place that don't really help me at all, right? Things are pretty nice now, and if you change them to like have people who aren't upper middle class white males, maybe have a little bit better shot, well, that's going to take some opportunities away from me. Why would I want that? So, Rawls thinks, have me forget that I'm an upper middle class white male in America. Right? An upper middle class, highly educated white male in America. If I don't know that about myself, there's all sorts of things that I'm going to be willing to do that I wouldn't be willing to do or go along with if I knew all these things about myself. Rawls's idea is, practically speaking, if people know how to be selfish and help just themselves, they're going to do it. And so ignorance is the key to getting people to sort of be fair and to sort of behave themselves. Now, that's not Kant's idea. Kant thinks, well, imagine everybody is able to overcome their selfishness by being rational. That's a little more pie in the sky, but it all ends up in the same place, because when you're being fully rational, you're sort of overcoming your desires. You're overcoming the aspects of you that are, well, not rational. And those are exactly the kinds of things that Rawls is getting you to forget, right? Behind the veil of ignorance, right? So there's all sorts of stuff that you desire, that you enjoy, that you like. And what Kant thinks is, well, most of that's just irrational, right? You happen to like certain things that you like because your experiences as a kid, right? Like your older siblings liked it, or your friends liked it, so you picked up the desire for it, or your parents like it, so now you do, right? That kind of stuff. None of that has to do with your rationality. And these are the kinds of things that you would forget. So what Kant is asking you to do with the kingdom of ends is live by principles that everyone would accept if they were being rational. And so that gives the sort of social aspect of the moral law, something that was kind of missing from Plato and Aristotle. The fact that Kant goes out of his way to have there be an aspect of this that is social. I mean, the Formula of Humanity is a little social in that it mentions other people, but other people only enter into it as constraints, right? So other people's humanity just places a constraint on you getting what you want. But the kingdom of ends is like we're all working together to develop this set of moral principles that, or set of moral rules that we all have to live by. Because if we're all equally rational, then we're all going to pick the same moral principles, because morality is about rationality. So these are the four laws, or the four formulations of the moral law. The formula of universal law, the formula of humanity, the formula of autonomy, and the formula of the kingdom of ends. They all concern themselves with human rationality and the value of human rationality, the nature of human rationality, things like that. In the next video, I'm going to talk about what happens a bit in Groundwork 3. I'm not going to be able to go into all of it. And what Kant has to say about the nature of that rationality or autonomy or free will.